All right, let's just jump right into this. I've got a fascinating question for you. Can we actually train our brains to handle stress better? And what if that exact same training could also crank up our creativity and our empathy? I know, it sounds a little like something out of a sci-fi movie, but the answer might be hiding in this really peculiar experiment from decades ago. So yeah, that's the big question we're going to tackle here. We are going to unpack a really fascinating and, let's be honest, a kind of strange study from back in 1978. And it suggests that we might have way more control over our own brains than we think, and that learning to, intentionally fire up specific parts of it could have a massive impact on our lives. Okay, so our story starts in 1978 at the Nova University Biofeedback Laboratories. A group of researchers there put together this really unique experiment to test a pretty specific idea. Could different kinds of stimulation actually change how our nervous system physically responds to stress? So here's what they did. They got 47 volunteers and split them into two completely different groups. The first group, which they called the right hemisphere activation group, got this very sensory, almost hypnotic experience. They watched a kinetic light sculpture, it was called a kinescope, while listening to meditative music. The second group, the left hemisphere activation group, had a much more, analytical job. They listened to spoken text while reading that exact same text on a screen. The whole point was to try and light up two totally different ways of thinking. Now, this is where the experiment gets really, really clever. See, they didn't just ask people, hey, how do you feel? No, they measured their stress response physically. They put everyone through this three-step stress test. First, they'd let them relax to get a calm baseline reading. Then, and this is the wild part, they intentionally startle them. We're talking a sudden flash of light, a hammer smacking a cabinet, even a surprise tap on the arm. And finally, they'd pull out a stopwatch and measure exactly how many seconds it took for their body to get back to that calm baseline. This gave them cold, hard, objective data. So the subjects went through this whole ordeal 6 times over 2 weeks. And when the researchers took all that biometric data, all the heart rates and skin responses from all those startle tests, and crunched the numbers, the results weren't just a little interesting. They were incredibly clear. This was not a fluke. And here is the absolute kicker. The difference between the two groups? It wasn't small. It wasn't even close. One group consistently recovered from the shock and got back to a calm state more than twice as fast as the other. And remember, this was the group just watching the light sculpture. So listen, we're not talking about a tiny improvement here. This was a giant leap in their ability to handle stress. And this chart just lays it all out crystal clear. The visual group, the ones watching the light show, they recovered in about 70 seconds on average. The verbal group, the ones reading and listening to text, took over 166 seconds. I mean, that is a massive difference in how quickly their nervous systems could literally calm down after a shock.
So what on earth is going on here, right? Why would watching some mesmerizing light display make you physically better at dealing with stress? Well, the whole theory behind the experiment points to the two very different ways our brain looks at the world. Well, a popular way to think about it is that our brain kind of has two different personalities. The left hemisphere is like a super meticulous accountant. It's logical, it loves language, it processes things one by one in a straight line. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is more like an artist. It's intuitive, it thinks in pictures and feelings, and it's amazing at seeing the whole big picture at once. Now, I know this is a simplified model, but it's a really handy way to grasp what that experiment was trying to do. Okay, so the artist side of our brain seems to be the key for relaxation. But you know what? The story does not end there. If we can train our brains to be less stressed, you gotta wonder, what other right brain traits could we maybe strengthen? And this is where it gets really, really interesting, because that same right brain is also tied to two other incredibly important human qualities, creativity and empathy. And this is where the conversation gets a lot bigger than just our personal well-being. According to something called the Torrance tests, which are a really respected way to measure creativity, scores here in the US have been steadily and significantly dropping since 1990. And the drop is especially bad in young kids. So that brings up a really important question. Are we, as a whole society, somehow neglecting the very part of our brain that this experiment suggests is so important?
Some really smart people, like the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, think so. He argues that our entire society, our schools, our jobs, our culture, has slowly shifted to prioritize that left brain analytical way of thinking. And in the process, we might be accidentally shutting down the right brain's ability to see connections, to feel empathy, and, as he puts it, to live a full life.
This connects perfectly to an idea you've probably heard of, the flow state. It was researched by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and flow is that magical feeling of being completely and totally absorbed in what you're doing. It's a peak creative mindset, and guess what? It's thought to be heavily powered by right brain activity.
And getting into that state isn't random. It takes a specific mix of things. A challenge that's tough but not impossible, intense focus, clear goals. It's that zone where you kind of forget yourself, and time just seems to melt away. And that deep, focused relaxation is exactly what the right brain is a master at.
But the story gets even deeper, because the very same right hemisphere that fuels our imagination and helps us get into that flow state is also understood to be the home of our ability to feel empathy, to connect with and actually understand what other people are feeling.
McGilchrist has this really beautiful way of putting it. He says the right brain sees the world not just as a collection of separate things, but as a web of living, changing, interconnected beings. I mean, that perspective is the absolute bedrock of empathy.
So let's tie this all together. The crucial point here is that this isn't just some quirky study from the 70s. It's pointing to something really profound about our own potential. It's suggesting that these basic human traits, stress resilience, creativity, empathy, they might not be as set in stone as we think they are.
So think about it like this. What if this is a new kind of workout, but for your mind? The 1978 study showed that right brain stimulation basically acted like a personal trainer for our stress response. And it's not a one-off finding. More recent studies show that things like compassion meditation can literally make us better at reading other people's emotions. It all points to this incredibly empowering idea that we can intentionally exercise the right side of our brain and strengthen these amazing traits, just like we'd build a muscle in the gym.
And that brings us to one final, and I think, really important question to leave you with. In our modern world, which is so often built for that logical, analytical, inner accountant, are we accidentally neglecting our inner artist? And if we are, what could be possible if we all started spending just a little more time training that other half of our minds? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What could we unlock?